They say the West wasn't built on gold or cattle. It was built on stories. Stories whispered by campfires and carried on the wind, stories that began in the dust and ended in the heart. This one began in the summer of 1874, in a place the maps barely remembered, a town called Dry Creek. 2 crooked streets, 3 saloons, a church that leaned like it had given up on standing straight. Folks here carried their secrets the way a horse carries its shadow, close and constant. And no one carried more than Elias Crow. Elias was a ranch hand with hands like leather and eyes the cold blue of a winter river. He wasn't a man who wasted words, and the few he did speak never told much about himself. He'd ride into town every Saturday, trade for flour and coffee, nod at the shopkeeper, and leave before the sun dipped low. He lived alone on a stretch of land 3 miles out, his only company the cattle he tended and the silence that settled over the prairie when the wind died down. It was the kind of quiet most men couldn't stand, but Elias wore it like an old coat. But quiet has a way of letting the past in. And Elias's past had sharp edges. A woman he'd once loved, taken by fever before they could wed. A younger brother he couldn't save during the war. The guilt sat deep in his bones, whispering in the dark hours that maybe he wasn't meant to hold on to anything good. That summer was a dry one. The land cracked, the air shimmered with heat, and the river that cut through the valley shrank to a slow-moving, muddy stretch. Even small, it could turn dangerous without warning. A storm in the hills could swell it into a raging beast in minutes. Elias kept to the banks now and again, checking for strays, listening to the cicadas whine in the trees. It was on one of those rides, under a sun that felt like it was burning the color right out of the world, that he heard it. A voice. Faint at first, then urgent. Not English. The rhythm was different, sharp and strange, yet soaked in fear. Elias turned his head toward the sound, scanning the river. Then he saw her. A woman, dark hair plastered to her face, arms thrashing against the pull of the current. She was beautiful in a way Elias had never seen, not the polished beauty of portraits in a saloon, but wild like the land itself. And she was going under. Elias didn't think. He slid from the saddle, boots sinking into the mud, and waded in. The current grabbed him like a live thing, trying to pull him down, but he pushed forward, teeth clenched, eyes locked on her. She slipped under once, twice, and just as she vanished a third time, his hand found her arm. He hauled her in, the weight of her body heavy against him, and fought toward the shore until his knees hit solid ground. They collapsed together on the bank, both gasping for air. She lay still, her chest rising and falling, water dripping from her clothes. Up close, Elias saw the bruises on her arms, the small cuts along her skin. She turned her head toward him, eyes black as obsidian, and for a moment neither of them moved. Something passed between them, wordless but heavy, like the stillness before a storm. She was too weak to stand. So Elias lifted her into his saddle and led the horse back toward his ranch. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He just knew she was hurt, and that leaving her behind was something he wouldn't live with. That night he sat by her bed, changing the cool cloth on her forehead, listening to her breathing steady little by little. Sometimes her lips moved, whispering in a language he didn't understand. When dawn began to touch the horizon, she opened her eyes. They were sharp now, awake, and fixed on him. She studied his face for a long time before speaking. Her voice was quiet, edged with curiosity. Why? He blinked. Because you were drowning. She seemed to weigh his words, her gaze not leaving his. Then she closed her eyes again, as if his answer was enough. Elias didn't know it yet, but saving her had tied him to something far older than the town, older than the war, older even than the fences that cut the land into pieces. In her world, there was a law. A life saved belonged to the saver. And her people would come for her. And when they did, they'd tell Elias Crow she was his. The knock came just after midday, sharp and deliberate against the wood of Elias's door. Out here, uninvited visitors were rare, and the kind who knocked usually meant trouble. Elias set down the tin cup in his hand and stepped to the door, his rifle leaning nearby in its usual place. When he opened it, the sunlight flooded in, along with shadows that didn't belong. 3 men stood on his porch. 2 wore their hair long, braids bound with leather, eyes dark and watchful. The third, older, with lines carved deep into his face, carried himself like a man used to being listened to. Their clothes spoke of the desert, soft buckskin, beads worked into the seams, and every one of them carried a weapon. The older man's gaze slid past Elias to the bed where she lay, still pale, but awake now. She was sitting up, a blanket around her shoulders, her black hair spilling loose. The moment her eyes found the old man, her expression shifted, not fear, but something weightier, harder to read. "You took her from the river," the man said. His voice was low, certain. "You pulled her back from death." Elias didn't answer right away. "She was drowning," he said at last. "I did what any man would do." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not any man. You brought her here. You gave her your roof." He stepped closer, the porch boards groaning under his weight. "By our law, she is yours." Elias frowned. "Yours?" The man gestured to the woman. "In our people's way, a life saved belongs to the one who saved it. She is bound to you now, by the river, by the spirits, by the word of her ancestors." Elias's gut tightened. "I didn't ask for that." "It does not matter if you asked," the man said. "The bond exists. If you turn her away, you turn away the will of the spirits, and they do not forgive such insults." The woman's gaze hadn't left Elias. Her hands were folded in her lap, still, but her eyes were alive with something fierce. She didn't speak, didn't defend herself or the law. She only waited. Elias wanted to say it was nonsense, some tradition that didn't hold weight under his roof. But the look in the old man's eyes told him this was no game. This was law older than any the territory's governor had signed, older than the border's men drew on maps. "I can't keep her here against her will," Elias said slowly. "You do not understand," the man replied. "She is here because of her will. The river took her. You brought her back. Her life is in your hands now, and with it her honor." A silence stretched between them, thick as the heat. The old man stepped back, nodding to the other 2. "We will leave her with you. In 7 days, we will return. If she is gone or harmed, you will answer to her blood." With that, they turned and rode off, the dust from their horses curling in the air long after they were gone. Elias closed the door, leaning against it for a moment. He could feel her eyes on him. "You're not my prisoner," he said without looking at her. "I know," she replied softly. He turned to face her. "Then why stay?" Her voice was quiet, steady. "Because I owe you. And in my world, debts of life are not repaid with coins. They are repaid with the heart." Elias felt the ground shift under him. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story, didn't even know why she'd been in that river. But something about the way she said it, the weight in her voice, told him this wasn't going to be something he could walk away from. Outside, the cicadas screamed in the heat. Inside, Elias Crow realized his quiet life had just ended. Word travels faster than the wind in a place like Dry Creek. By the 3rd morning, folks in town already knew Elias Crow had an Apache woman under his roof. They didn't know how she got there or why, but truth didn't stand much chance against gossip. When Elias rode in for supplies, the stares followed him. Men on the boardwalk leaned against posts, their eyes narrow. Women in bonnets paused in their errands, just long enough to whisper behind gloved hands. He heard one word more than once: trouble. At the general store, Silas Merrick, the shopkeeper, slid the flour across the counter and said, "You're keeping her then?" Elias's jaw tightened. "She's hurt. She needs rest." Silas raised a brow. "That all she needs?" Elias didn't answer. He left the coins on the counter and walked out, feeling the eyes on his back. When he returned to the ranch, she was outside, standing barefoot in the dust, her dark hair lifted by the wind. She was looking toward the horizon, toward the hills where her people lived. She turned as he approached, and he saw the faintest shadow of a smile. "You went to town," she said. "I had to," he replied. "Food doesn't appear on its own." They don't like me there. It wasn't a question. They don't know you, he said. She tilted her head, studying him. Do you? Elias didn't have an answer for that. He only knew that in the short days she'd been here, the silence in his house had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was watchful. That night, over the small fire in the hearth, she told him her name. Naya. She spoke of the river, how she'd been chased there by men from another settlement, how she'd slipped in trying to cross. She didn't tell him why they were chasing her, and Elias didn't press. But trouble didn't need an invitation. It came 2 nights later. He was sitting on the porch, the moon hanging low and red over the land, when he heard hoofbeats. 3 riders approached, their shapes cut from the darkness. They stopped just short of the porch, their horses restless in the cool night air. One of them leaned forward in the saddle. We heard you're keeping a squaw here, the man drawled. Elias stood, his hands loose at his sides but his stance unyielding. She's under my protection. The man spat into the dirt. That ain't worth much. Try me. A long moment stretched, the air brittle with the promise of violence. Then the men turned their horses and rode off, laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Inside, Naya had been standing just behind the door, silent. When he stepped in, she looked at him with something between gratitude and fear. They will be back, she said quietly. I know, Elias replied, and so will your people. Neither of them said what both were thinking, that the moment those 2 forces met, there would be no talking it down. For the first time in years, Elias felt the old stirring in his chest, the one that came before a fight worth standing for. And looking at Naya, he knew this was exactly that kind of fight. The days ahead would test him in ways the war never had. And when it came, the choice he made would change both their lives forever. The 7th day came with a sky the color of tarnished silver, clouds rolling low over the hills. Elias had been awake since before dawn, the kind of restless morning where coffee didn't calm a man's nerves. He stood at the fence, watching the land stretch toward the horizon, knowing before long riders would appear. Naya was inside, quiet, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she, too, felt the weight of the day pressing down. The first to arrive was not her people. It was the men from town. 5 of them this time, riding hard, their faces tight with something between anger and anticipation. At their head was Tom Vickers, a rancher who'd lost more cattle to Apaches than he could count, or so he claimed. He reined in close, his horse stamping at the dirt. You're handing her over, Crow, Vickers said, his voice flat. This ain't about law, it's about keeping the peace. Elias didn't move. You don't get to decide what peace looks like on my land. She's trouble, Vickers snapped. Her people burned my barn 3 winters ago. She's no different. She's not a thief, Elias said. She's not your enemy. But if you keep pushing, I will be. The air between them tightened. One of Vickers's men shifted in his saddle, hand resting near his rifle. Then, from the far edge of the valley, another sound rose, the deep, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats. Naya's people. They came in a line, slow but sure, the old man from before riding at the front. His eyes swept over the scene in a glance that took in every detail. The men from town, the rifles, Elias standing like a wall between them and the woman inside. This is our day, the old man said, his voice carrying. We come for what is ours. She's not yours, Vickers shot back. She don't belong to anyone. The old man's gaze cut to Elias. By the river, by the spirits, she is his, and no others. Vickers laughed, the sound hard. You think we're going to let your superstitions decide what happens here? She goes with us, Crow. Or she goes to them. Either way, she's leaving. Elias stepped forward, planting himself in the space between the 2 sides. She's staying here. She's under my roof, and she stays as long as she chooses. Behind him, Naya appeared in the doorway, her hair loose, her eyes calm in a way that made the whole scene seem smaller. She looked at the old man, then at Vickers, and, finally, at Elias. I will not be taken, she said, her voice steady. I choose to stay. The old man's face softened, just enough to show he understood. He nodded once. Then, it is decided. A bond made by the river is not broken by men's voices. Vickers cursed under his breath, spurred his horse, and the others followed. They rode off in a storm of dust, their anger trailing behind them. When the dust settled, the old man looked to Elias. "You have taken her life into your hands. Treat it as you would your own." Then he turned, leading his riders back toward the hills, leaving Elias and Naya alone in the stillness. Elias turned to her. She didn't smile, but there was something in her eyes, trust, maybe, or the beginning of it. For a man who had spent so long believing he wasn't meant to hold on to anything good, it felt like the start of something worth fighting for. The West had a way of testing a man's claim to the things he cared about. Elias knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to take her from him. But he also knew the truth now. The bond wasn't just hers by law or his by right. It was theirs, built in the current of a river and sealed in the quiet choice of two people who had every reason to walk away and didn't. Some stories in the West end in gunfire, others in dust. But every once in a while, a story ends with something rarer, two lives bound together, not by chance, not by law, but by the will to stay. And out on that quiet stretch of land, with the clouds breaking and the hills standing guard, Elias Crow and Naya began theirs. Summer settled heavy over the plains, the kind that made the air shimmer above the dirt and turned every breath into slow work. Life on the ranch found a rhythm again, but nothing was quite the same. Naya moved through the house like she'd always belonged there, mending shirts with a quiet precision, tending the small patch of garden that had never survived under Elias's hands. She didn't speak much of her people, though sometimes Elias would catch her standing outside at dusk, eyes fixed on the far ridges where the light turned the hills to fire. He didn't ask what she was thinking. Some silences weren't meant to be broken. The town kept its distance, though not out of acceptance, only out of the uneasy respect that follows a man willing to stand his ground. Vickers didn't come back, but Elias knew men like him rarely forgot a slight. Trouble has a way of circling back in the West, the way a hawk circles before it dives. One afternoon, Naya came in from the garden, her hands stained with the dark scent of tomato vines. She set a jar on the table, a small thing, filled with wildflowers. "Why flowers?" Elias asked. "They remind you that even in hard places, something can grow," she said simply. Her words stayed with him. That night, as they ate by lamplight, he told her about his time before the war, the land he'd worked with his father, the home that burned when raiders came through, the feeling of being left with nothing worth returning to. She listened without pity, only understanding. "I think," she said after a long pause, "we are both learning how to stay." It was then Elias realized the river hadn't just brought her into his life, it had changed its course entirely. What began as an act of rescue had turned into something he could never have planned, a shared life, a shared fight, a bond forged in more than just survival. Months later, when autumn painted the land gold, a rider came from the hills. It was the old man again. He brought no demands, only news. The tribe had marked Naya as a friend who chose her own path. There would be no more claims, no more shadows from past. After he left, Naya stood on the porch, watching the sun dip low. "It is over," she said quietly. Elias looked at her. The woman who had come to him out of a river's pull, who had faced down two worlds and chosen her own. "No," he said, a faint smile in his voice. "It's just beginning." And so it was. In a land where most stories were written in dust and blood, theirs became something rare. A tale the wind carried. A love not born of luck, but of choice. Years later, folks would still speak of Elias Crow and the Apache woman he saved from the river. How the bond they forged held stronger than law, stronger than hate, stronger even than the river itself. Because in the Wild West, where everything can be taken, the greatest thing a man can hold on to is someone who chooses to stay.